Now here in front of me are all the parts for the Wi-Fi Gun Mk2, and this video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be assembling this here on the camera. This is a commission that somebody asked me to build. Now the Wi-Fi Gun is probably, it's not the most popular, but one of the most popular videos on my channel. And I've been asked over the last few years to make one of these quite a few times for people, but I always turn them down because the Wi-Fi gun, to be quite frank, is complete rubbish. It does work, but it's a really old-fashioned design, and the amount of effort that goes into making that particular antenna is just not worth it. There are better builds out there, but this particular guy contacted me and he wanted me to commission to build one for him, but I said I would under the proviso that I redesigned it so that it worked really well and he wouldn't be disappointed with the performance. And this is what I've come up with. I'll include a PDF down in the description for all the measurements for all the parasitic elements and the main driven element there. The reflector that I'm using is an oversized one. The minimum it needs to be is 80mm by 80mm. This is slightly bigger, 125mm by 125, because the guy wanted a bigger reflector. It does help, gives a little bit more forward gain, but it is oversized. And as I say in this video, I'm going to be constructing this, putting it all together. I haven't put every part together yet, only in pieces as I've been testing this and coming up with a manufacturing process. So yeah, we're going to assemble this antenna. I'll take it over to the network analyzer. I'll show you its frequency response, and we'll do a bit of a Wi-Fi scan as well, so you can see how it actually performs. But he did want this to resemble a gun, and I think that's what I've created here. So let's get on with the video, assemble this, and you can see what it looks like, and then we'll give it a bit of a test. Now, one thing you're going to notice straight away is that the original Wi-Fi gun was all circles, and this one is a rectangle shaped element, and that's all the way through here. A little bit easier to make, not as much labor involved in cutting the circles out, and to be quite honest with you, these work better than the circle elements. They're just more refined in the measurements for RF at 2.4 GHz than the circle ones are. The circle ones do have a use in RF for different purposes, but basically this is a Yagi / panel antenna, and the rectangle ones do work a lot better than having the circle ones, so that's why we're going for rectangle ones. As I said, I wanted this one to work and work well, unlike the first Wi-Fi gun. Now I'm going to start off first by constructing the framework of this Wi-Fi gun, and this was actually the hardest part to make of this antenna. It certainly took me quite a few days, especially to get a nice finish on the perspex. But we've got a handle here that I got from a cheap saw that I picked up at a hardware store. I didn't buy it because it was cheap. I bought it because it was the only black handle that I could find. They were either black with orange foam or things like that on there, but this one has worked out really well. I've modified it so it will fit the thickness of this perspex in between here, so we can use the same mounting holes and bolts to attach this to the frame. You can see here how thin the blade originally was. I've attached a alpha holder on the back here, and the alpha holder has a little notch part in here, which I cut out the rectangle into the handle and just epoxied it in place, so we've got a really strong mounting point there. And yeah, this has worked out really well. The saw only cost me about £4. The rest of it is made out of this perspex. I bought this perspex, cut it into strips, and I've done joints just like you would for a piece of woodworking. I've also got the mount here for a tripod, extended it out with this disc of perspex here just to give it a nice large mounting point to take all the weight. The disc I got pre-cut off of eBay. A lot of people are offering that service now. The perspex I just cut up using my bandsaw into strips, and yeah, basically this is what took me the greatest length of time to just figure it out. I had to do a few drawings and really think about it for a few days before I attempted this, but it's worked out really well. So I'm going to attach all these together with some super glue on the joints here, and that'll give me a nice strong base to build the rest of the antenna off. And when I'm assembling something like this, I just like to clean as I go. So any drips of super glue, just use a little bit of fine wire wool just to get rid of those. And as for the handle, that's just held in place with the original nuts and bolts that came with the saw. Now before we move on to the rest of the antenna, I just wanted to show you the tripod. This is a tripod that I picked up off eBay, pretty cheap. I think it cost me about £2.50 from China, and it basically folds down, as you can see here, into a very nice handle. These splay out at the sides here to form a tripod, but yeah, it makes a very nice handle. And when this is connected to the bottom, I'll just screw it in here quickly. And now looking at it with that tripod connected there, you can see that it has got a form factor now resembling a gun, which is what the customer wanted. So when we build the antenna, we've got a fully functioning antenna, and also the form factor resembles a gun. So now moving on to the antenna itself, I'm first going to attach the back reflector. Now, as I said, this is an oversized reflector. You don't have to use anything this big. It's 2mm thick brass, and I had it cut like this. I didn't have to cut this brass. Again, you can get cutting services on eBay pretty cheaply. They don't charge a great deal of money. But you can see I've drilled a hole through the center, which is going to connect to this little bit of threaded rod here. And I've also attached the coax, the outer braid, onto the reflector itself, and we've got the inner core ready to connect onto the main driven element. And this does take a little bit of soldering, with this being 2mm. The technique that I use is I get a blowtorch and I heat up the brass in this area here, let all that heat travel down, flow solder around there, and then get in with the soldering iron and just tin up the pre-soldered outer braid onto where I flowed solder on here. Again, maintaining heat into this with a blowtorch, and then using the soldering iron just to finish off. Otherwise you'll never do it with a soldering iron. It'll just extract heat sink all that heat away from your iron, and it will never flow. But that's a technique that I use when using something as thick as this. Heat it up in one corner, let the heat flow, and then get in there with the soldering iron. And I'm going to attach it in place with the first spacer here. These are M3 spacers, and this one is a 10mm spacer because the driven element wants to be 10mm away from the back reflector. Again, all the measurements are on the PDF that you can download, link in the description. So next I'm going to attach the main driven element, and you can see here that I've cut in where I'm going to connect to it, a feed point here. This is cut in 11.2mm in depth, and it's 3mm wide, and there's a small hole, 1mm hole drilled out in the bottom there, so we can connect this up through the hole in the center to the standoff, and then we can solder in our coax. But what I'm going to do is put a little bit of a bend in this to bring it much closer to the back reflector, and that just improves the VSWR a little bit. If you wanted to, you could just drill a straight hole in this and connect it flush like that, but doing this you'll get a little bit better VSWR, because all Yagis tend to have a high VSWR, so it's just one way of reducing that a little bit. Now I've got the macro lens on because this step here is very, very important, and this isn't a shorter design. The main driven element is completely isolated from the rest of the antenna, isolated from the reflector and the rest of the boom. Well, I want the boom to be electrically connected all the way along with all the parasitic elements. So what I've got here is a little bit of heat shrink tubing just down there, and I've also got these little nylon washers as well that fit in between. So I'm having one on the back here, a little bit of heat shrink tubing, and then another nylon washer sandwiching the main driven element in there. So I'm hoping that that'll do a good job of isolating it, and I will check it for continuity afterwards, and I'll just keep doing it until I get it completely isolated, because without it being isolated, the VSWR of this antenna is rubbish. It turns it into a good receiving antenna, but a very, very poor transmitting antenna. A lot like the original Wi-Fi Gun, to be honest with you. It wasn't too bad at picking up signals, but it was completely useless at transmitting. But hopefully you can see what I'm doing there. So that's the main driven element fitted in place, and it's probably the trickiest part of this antenna build to do, but you can see those two washers, they're isolating that driven element from the boom that we're now creating, and that little bit of heat shrink, of course. But I've tested the continuity, it's not shorted out in any way, and you can also see how we've connected it to the coax there. So what I'm going to do now is just continue building this boom off with all the parasitic elements. As I said, the measurements are down in the description, but we've got a 15mm spacer here, and then we're going to add the parasitic elements, and each parasitic element is spaced out by 25mm spacers. Now I'm getting on with installing the parasitic elements, and I thought this would be a good place to stop and just talk about the design of this antenna briefly. Yeah, it's kind of a Yagi panel antenna mix, but unlike the Yagi, because we're using a panel antenna to start off with, we're starting off with slightly higher gain. So the panel antenna on its own would be about 6 dB of gain, where a traditional Yagi antenna with a dipole element there as the feed, you're starting off around 3 dB. So we're starting off with a higher dB, and we've got 3 parasitic elements on at the moment, and that's given me a total of 9 dB. Now the tipping point here now is the elements, parasitic elements that I start adding from now on, instead of one parasitic element giving me 1 dB of gain, I'm now going to have to start adding 2 parasitic elements to give me 1 dB of gain. And then we get to another tipping point when we get to around 14, where we've got to start adding 3 parasitic elements, and then we get to 16 dB of gain, and then we've got to start adding 4 or 5 parasitic elements to get 1 dB of gain. So when I see these designs day to day, and when you understand how different antennas work, you can estimate the gain of an antenna just by looking at it, which is why I laugh sometimes with some of the other YouTube videos you see where people are claiming to get 3 miles with an antenna that's probably nothing like the dB that they're claiming. And the same with some of the sellers on eBay and Amazon and Banggood. They just exaggerate things. You can't break the laws of physics, but as it stands now, this is a pretty nice antenna with 9 dB of gain, but the customer wants it to be a lot more powerful and longer, so I'm going to keep adding the parasitic elements. So this is the Wi-Fi gun completed then. If I haven't mentioned it before, the back reflector is 2mm thick, and the main driven element and the parasitic element are 0.5mm thick. So they are thin enough, the parasitic element and the main driven element, they're thin enough to cut with a pair of scissors at 0.5mm. But as I say, 2mm, you're going to need something like a bandsaw, or do what I did and get it pre-cut. But yeah, it's definitely long. Now, if we want to talk about gain, a Yagi with 21 parasitic elements like this has got would work around 18 dB of gain, somewhere between 17 and 18 dB of gain if it's built well. This one, because it's based off a panel antenna here, it's starting off with a little bit more gain than a folded dipole, so this should work somewhere around 20-21 dB of gain, a little bit more than a Yagi of the same size. But yeah, I like the way this looks. It certainly looks like it's gonna do the business. And one last thing that the customer wants me to put on is my name. He wants me to sign it, so I'm going to just got some double-sided tape, and I'm going to put my name on around that area there. So I've decided to use the spectrum analyzer to take a look at this. We haven't used this piece of equipment in a while, and I've just given it a bit of a service, but you can see the Wi-Fi gun there, and that's the test setup down there, and here's the output on the spectrum analyzer. So here's the output on the spectrum analyzer, and we're scanning at 10 megahertz per division. We've got it centered on 2447 gigahertz there, and it's bang in the middle, and we have this lovely frequency response just there, right where we want it for the Wi-Fi spectrum. A really nice output. I was a little bit worried that with the amount of parasitic elements we've got on this Yagi, it might change the frequency response a little bit, but no, it stayed bang in the middle. So let's give this a Wi-Fi scan then, see how many access points we can pick up. Now normally I would like to get a shot of the antenna that we're testing and the output on Vista Stumbler at the same time, but because of the size of this I'm not going to be able to do it. So we'll just look at Vista Stumbler, and what I'll do is I'll pick this up and I'll rotate it 360 degrees around and see how many access points we can pick up from here in the lab. Remember, the lab is also quite well shielded, so I'm kind of guessing possibly 40 access points, but we shall see. Remember, the first two that you'll see are here with me in the lab, so just ignore them 100% ones. But I'm hoping to get, you know, maybe 40 access points, maybe 45 access points, but we'll take a look, give it a scan, and let's see how well it performs. It should perform really well, looking at how well that frequency response was on the spectrum analyzer. So I'm rotating it now slowly. 17 access points. $25, $26, looking good. $30. $38. Almost a full rotation. And there we go, 360 degree rotation. Let's see how many access points we've got. 47 access points, not bad at all. And a lot of those are dead now, but if we scroll along and have a look, you can see that the high signal that it picked up on a lot of those access points is pretty good, above 50%. So the majority of them are pretty good signals. You'll be able to connect to a lot of those if they were open. Not bad at all. Now I'm really impressed with how this has performed, and as you saw with that Wi-Fi scan, I can say hand on heart that this definitely is a 20 to 21 dB antenna. It really is powerful. It's about as powerful as you can get without using a dish. I mean, this is up there on the limit. And the thing is, you may be thinking, well, we'll add some more parasitic elements, but the problem with that is the amount of power you can use legally with Wi-Fi, that just starts depreciating, and adding more parasitic elements onto this makes the antenna underperform. You actually lose some performance because, you know, you can't go pumping 10 watts through this. If you could with Wi-Fi, then adding more parasitic elements, yeah, it can it can perform better. But this is about the ceiling of performance that you can get from an antenna before you start moving on to something like a parabolic dish. Yeah, this really does perform really well, and I know that from the pictures that I've sent the seller, he's really pleased and can't wait to get his hands on it. But as I said, this is not the first time I've been asked to build the Wi-Fi gun, but yeah, with the changes, it performs really well. The original Wi-Fi gun was mediocre at best, and it took a lot of time to build that and cut out all the circles as well. I mean, if you want to put that kind of effort into making an antenna, as I said in that original video, there's much better antennas you can put your time into building. Even a simple antenna will outperform that original Wi-Fi gun. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As I said, the PDF for this will be down below with all the measurements on, as per usual. As I said, this was more of an assembly, but you know, in previous videos I've shown how to cut out 0.5mm brass. You can do it with a heavy pair of scissors, no problem at all. You know, all the techniques for drilling and things like that, they're all in previous videos. So this has hopefully made it a little bit shorter, and you know, have a go at making one of these. Personally, I've got enough parts left over. I'm going to make one that's a little bit shorter, probably about half the size, for me to keep in my collection. And I do keep a lot of the antennas that I build in my collection, and hopefully one day I'll have a space big enough to display them all. But I can tell you hand on heart, I have not kept that original Wi-Fi gun that I built. That's not in my collection at all. So yeah, if you did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up. Please share it. It really does help if you share. Comments or questions, drop them below and I'll do my best to answer them. Pop over to the Facebook forum group page, antennas, and the link will be below if you've got any in-depth questions you want answering. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully you'll join me on the next one.